Okay then, so I did go and record a recording for the fourth book, but I decided to myself that it wasn't that good. So we're just gonna delete that and just ignore that ever existed, so to speak. And this is the thing about rogues, by the way. You can't record stuff over and over again, but with the lore here, I can record that all day if I want to. So we're just gonna make a second attempt at this, so to speak. Now, I will note something about this character I'm using right here, Davian Unlock. I will note that basically this guy here is basically anti-magic. And I basically already picked up basically the quest basically for rescuing the crocs of this guy basically here. So just want to throw that out there. I may show it off this character, not really sure. We'll see. But there's basically the trapdoor into Nick ruins, so perhaps something to do with this character, we'll see. Basically. But that's not what this episode is basically all about. It's basically all about the lore, so let's get to that. And here we go. Escapades of Fay Willows, Book 4, Chapter 1, The Exhaustive Travel. The endurance of an ogre is quite astonishing. While I had collapsed from exhaustion, the ogres had persevered and managed to stay awake until we made it into the abandoned settlement. In particular, while many of the ogres had managed to acquire some sleep along with me, the commander and strategist would manage to make the entire journey to Elvala before they would finally collapse from exhaustion. I honestly don't believe any of our race could possibly stay awake, let alone active, for that long. I don't know how long I had spent within that hellish shoreline, perhaps days or even a week. It was good to see some semblance of greenery and living nature again as we proceeded to head into the area just south of Nargo lands. I basked a little in the natural sunlight from the sky before feeling the rumbling in my stomach and the heavy weight of exhaustion from so much running. The ogres for their part did not seem the least bit tired or hungry, but after such a long travel, I wondered if this was truly the case. Reaching for my pack, I pulled out my provisions and laid them on the ground. Almost immediately I noticed the hungry stares from the ogres. Have you ever seen a hungry ogre? Within an instant, they will eat any food in front of them. I barely had time to get out of the way before the entire group of them converged on the tasty morsels that had come into view. When I looked back next, I noticed that all the provisions I had laid out were gone, and the ogres were now rummaging through my backpack to see if they could find any more. After failing to find any, they adopted some semblance of civility once more. The commander got up and came over to thank me for the food, and asked I excuse himself and the others for their over-eagerness. That didn't do anything for my own hunger, but I'm glad they enjoyed filling their stomachs, I guess. From behind, the strategist approached, and clutched in his hand was one of the rations of food from my bag. Noticing it, I quickly snatched at the food when he offered it, and hungrily devoured it. Half of it had already been eaten, but considering how hungry I was, I didn't really care. Both the commander and the strategist seemed to chuckle at this. As they regained their composure, though, I could see the reality of the situation creep back into their faces. Once again, I could see the dark blue glow appear over the eyes of the commander's face as he looked in the direction of the southern shoreline. Any sign of them? The strategist asked. No, but that doesn't mean we are in the clear, the commander responded. I don't remember much after that. I do recall that the commander and the strategist talked to each other for a bit, but apparently during the conversation, I passed out. When I woke up, I was next to a campfire on a couple of mattresses, sandwiched between a couple of ogres. Above the fire, a skewered wolf was slowly being turned, and seeing me wake up, the ogre turned to spits, called out that I was awake. Looking around, I noticed several ogres silently sleeping on various makeshift beds and chairs, ranging from bags of grass on the ground and tables propped next to walls. I could tell that we were now in one of the abandoned shore-going settlements, which made me wonder as to just how long I was out and what had happened since. The commander and strategist then approached from behind one of the buildings. The strategist called out, "How are you doing, thalore? Did you rest well?" I was a bit groggy when waking up, but I replied back, "I'll rest better when we get to Elvala. What has happened?" To this I received a quick story, knowing that we had arrived at the outskirts of shoreline territory, and that the ogres had carried me here after I collapsed. Periodically from behind, I could see the commander looking out in various directions with his vision ruin, still on the lookout for any trouble. The strategist noted that what appeared to be scouts for the old zealots had been following us, but hanging back far in the distance. "We can't linger here much longer," the strategist commented. Looking at the strategist, I asked, "When will we be heading out next?" Before the strategist even had a chance to reply, the commander boomed from behind him, "Immediately after you've had something to eat." I could tell that from the commander's facial expressions that he was suggesting to me cooking above the fireplace. I was a bit disgusted by the thought of this, so I thought that I would go acquire my own food. The commander looked at me when I said this, pausing for a moment, but with a sigh he told me, "Be quick," before turning away and proceeding to rouse the sleeping ogres from their slumber. After a little while of searching through the nearby buildings, I noticed a trap door with a rusty lock. Breaking it and ascending a ladder, I found a cellar, untouched since the time the original shoreline inhabitants had lived here. I found several bottles of wine, as well as some old vegetables and dried fruit. I brushed away some cobwebs from a nearby chair and table to eat my fill, before carrying a bundle of vegetables and fruit back up to the ogre's campsite. The commander was already assembling the other ogres, and I could see that the couple recently killed carcasses slung on their shoulders. Seeing me carrying food, the commander and strategist came over to help take the load and asked where I found it. I relayed to them the location of the cellar, which I had found, and its contents. The commander, while interested in acquiring food, was quite disinterested in the fact that it was located in a shoreline cellar. Concerned with the time it would take to bring it up, he noted that an ogre wouldn't be able to easily fit through any of the doors in the summit here, let alone a trapdoor to one of the cellars. The strategist though noted that I had fit through and insisted that we take the food to ensure that there was enough to eat for the remainder of our journey. The commander was hesitant at staying any longer, but consented. After spending another hour, I was able to bring up all the food before we continued on toward Elvala. Alright, so the first chapter here is basically sort of like, detailing the events right after, the battle of, the cultists. And, honestly, these guys are exhausted, so, I had to, have something in there where, they're sort of having some downtime, so to speak. And, probably, the Zigur is, possibly in pursuit, but at the same time, they're, also, badly, hammered as well, so not really, able to keep up, so to speak. It's also worth noting as well, I have a little bit, little bits of tidbits in the lore here for the ogres as well, because we learn a little bit about the disposition to where, food, shall we say, because, if they're hungry, they'll want to eat it, and, they'll, do it, nothing, to stop them from eating it. And we also learn a little bit about, the nature of, housing for the ogres, because, it's basically a common theme in this game that the ogres are basically too big for, a lot of stuff, so, if you play, the Empress of Rage campaign, you'll basically find out that the ogres are, too big for beds, because, they'll basically smash through it, right? And they ask for chairs because they realize how difficult it is to acquire ogre-sized furniture for themselves. But whatever. Anyhow, that's basically the first chapter. So let's just move on. So, seeking sanctuary. I want to emphasize that I come from a society where there is little, if any, practiced magic, let alone any products of it as such as runes. While there were thalore who could use magic, their knowledge was self-taught and done in secret. Not to mention that thalore users of magic were generally ostracized from the rest of the community, if not exiled from Thaloran lands. Even now, I still don't know much about the inner workings of the Ruin Return that is grafted to me, though I'm working to learn the basics of ruins and a greater subject of the arcane forces behind them. Alright, so, just a little tidbit about, like, the Floran background and stuff, because, like, the Floran, they're not very well versed in the arcane, but they are good with nature and stuff like that, but whatever. Alright. Excuse me for a moment there. Alright, let's continue. We continue deeper into Shaloran territory. The fanatic scouts continue to follow us, but always careful to stay back and never stray too close. It would be a couple of more days before we reached the edge of the shroud. Navigating to where I had first crossed through the misty walls to get into the city, I reached into my pack to retrieve the Ruin Return that I received so long ago. With an outstretched hand, I presented it to the Ogre Commander. I expected him to take it, but he simply nodded his head and noted, "A Ruin Return." For the next brief moment I stood there with my hand held out, the Commander seemingly as puzzled as I was as to our interaction. It wasn't clear until the strategist finally chimed in. "You have no clue how that ruin you're holding works, do you?" At this, the Commander blinked before realizing the situation, noting, "Right, you're a complete novice." I could feel the blank expression more on my face, and the Ogres were seemingly aware of this. "Come over here, thalore," a voice rang out, or call out. I turned my head to see who was calling me, before noting it was the female ogre that had helped from before. "Let's see that ruin you got." I was a bit confused, but I made my way over and presented the ruin. Taking it in one hand, he proceeded to examine the ruin before handing it back to me. "Right," the ogre began. "This here ruin is bonded to you, so only you can inscribe it. After that is done, you can use the ruin to enter Elvala and request entry for us." It felt like the words popping out of the ogre's mouth were some type of different language. The ogre, who I would eventually come to know as my instructor, gave a series of explanations about ruins, though eventually decided it would just be better to graft the Ruin Return on me instead of giving me a lesson on ruin theory. To ensure that I would have the least trouble activating the ruin, the ogre chose to graft it on my back, just below my neck. I can remember how painful the experience was, as the nerves in the back of my spine were pricked and prodded at. Despite the pain though, I can also remember the exhilaration my body felt as it was touched by arcane forces for the first time. There then, finished. Pleased with our work, the ogre circled around me to put her hands on my shoulders. "Now, all that is left for you to do is for you to get past the barrier and make the request for our entry. Thalore, before I tell you what to do to activate the ruin, know that I thank you for helping to bring us this far. If it hadn't been for you, we ogres, we likely would have all died." I could see the tears begin to stream down the face of the ogre as she continued. "Once again, it seems our lives are in your hands. I hope that you will be able to convince the Shaloran to let us in, but even if you can't, I want to thank you. We all want to thank you." Around me I could see the ogres bowing their heads. With a smile I replied back, "I'm sure you will be let in. Tell me what it is I need to do." Raising her head while wiping away the tears from her face, I was walked through the process to activate the ruin. I gave a solemn nod to the ogres before performing the steps myself. Within an instant, my surroundings completely changed as I could hear the bustling of Shaloran all around me. I could feel a heavy sensation on my neck where a neck had been inscribed, where a ruin had been inscribed, but other than that I felt no different. A few of the Shaloran turned to look in my direction, seemingly surprised at my entry, though not as much as I would have expected. One of the Shaloran soon called out, "You're the thalore who helped us from before. Welcome back." "Oh, thank you," I replied back, slowly adjusting to the fact that I had abruptly entered Elvala. Quickly, I realized that the ogres were still outside of Elvala waiting for me. Excusing myself, I proceeded to run to the middle of town, where I previously met the general. As before, there stood guards outside the building, though they recognized me as I approached. Panting and out of breath, I took a brief moment to inhale and exhale before gasping out, "Ogres! Seeking asylum! Here in Elvala!" The guards in front of me stood in bewilderment after hearing the sentence I let out, seemingly grasping what I had said, but unable to determine what to do. Then from behind me came a voice. "What is this all about, ogres?" I turned around to see a young female thalore, who I recognized as being one of the mages who saw me off from Elvala. Seeing me, she seemed to be oddly cool a bit and addressed me saying, "Ooh, you're that thalore. We'd never personally met, but I helped teleport you out of Elvala a short while ago. Welcome back to Elvala." Catching my breath, I explained the situation involving the ogres outside, the zealots chasing them, and how they were looking to seek refuge in Elvala. As I finished talking, the young thalore stated, "Judging from what you have told me, it would likely be best if those ogres were brought in quickly." Approaching the guards to communicate something, their bewildered faces quickly became somewhat distressed both by the actions and the words of the thalore woman. I don't know what the mage had said, but it seemed as if the guards were almost pleading with the young thalore woman about something. Eventually, she called for me to follow her, and began to move in the direction I had come from when I entered the city with the Rune of Return. I could tell that this thalore seemed to have some plan in mind, perhaps one that would allow ogres passage into the city. Before turning to follow her, I noticed the two guards murmur something to each other before one of them rushed inside the building. The other seemed to look worriedly in the direction of me and the mage as we walked away. Alright, so this is sort of like a little bit overly detailed, but it basically sort of like gives like a grasp of like the floor basically being like very like arcane in reverse. They don't actually see a whole lot of like magic, so like they have no idea like how runes basically work. So this sort of like builds on that a little bit, and also like shows off the fact that like the ogres are like, yes, it's a ruin. What do you want me to do about it? Because the ogres probably suspect that like everyone else, like all the other races, know how to use ruins. It's just like the floor who really don't have like any clue how to basically operate them, so to speak. It's also worth knowing as well that like when we basically get down to like the young like thalore here, basically this is basically sort of like building onto what's basically going to happen next, so to speak, because she's basically sort of important like as a character here. And let's basically like get to that like further down the road. So here we go. Let's get to it. The Enchantress. Alraewyn Maj'Eyal, the foolhardy Enchantress. Easily the worst conversationalist I've ever met, and among all the Thaloren I know of none that has a greater ego than hers. Still, I respect her sense of justice, as well as her gifted abilities in the arcane. Who knows what fate may have happened to the ogres had she not been present when I made the request for their entry. Along the way, the young mage probed me with varying questions relating to my travels and the events that I have witnessed or have been a part of. Of those questions asked, though, the ones involving the treatment of the ogres has struck out in my mind the most. So the ogres! I've heard a little bit about them. While they never really traveled here to Elvala, I've heard stories of their altruism and heroics. But from what you told me about those crazy lunatics, it seems rather odd that they wouldn't have killed the ogres outright. I mean, they have obviously managed to merge their bodies with arcane ruins. What more reason is there for someone who hates magic to just kill them? To just kill them then and there? For what purpose do you think they were kept alive? I responded coldly to the question. I do not know the reason, nor do I care. For what purpose would you attempt to discern any meaning from their mad actions anyways? I see little reason for you or any thalore to care. Laughing at this, the young thalore replied, "Perhaps you are right. But just because these cultists seem to act mad to you, doesn't mean that they pursue whatever doctrines their doctrines are aimlessly. They will be our enemies for sure in the future, but hopefully before we ever truly encounter them, we can at least learn their motives. If we can understand how they act, we can understand what moves they will make, and we can make plans to counter their schemes as a result." Continuing on, I noticed that the thalore was intently looking at me, or rather at the back of my neck. Judging from where the rune I crafted was placed, I guess the ogres helped you with inscribing my rune of return. Taking a moment to process what the thalore said, I soon spouted, "You crafted." The thalore smiled and laughed a bit before continuing. Indeed I did. A masterwork produced by the best enchanters in Elvala. Though I'm wondering why you didn't graft it on your own skin yourself. Or are the Thalore really that backwards when it comes to the arcane? I remember the cool expression they gave, which she immediately picked up on before replying. Right, I'll try to keep that in mind next time I meet a Thalore. Nearing the outer edges of Elvala, where the shroud was, the enchantress asked where exactly the ogres would be. I noted to her that I left them in the same place where I had entered through the shroud on my first visit, and promptly led her to that spot on my initial entry. Standing stoically, she raised her arms and seemed to sing in a low harmonic sound, and almost immediately the misty smoke began to part. Any skepticism I had as to what she planned was soon replaced with astonishment, as a tunnel smaller in size than the one I traveled formed in front of us. From the other side of the tunnel, I could see the distant figures of the ogres appear. Not missing a beat, I could see the ogres begin to move toward us. After a few minutes, the first of them began to run inside Elva's walls before collapsing to the ground. Behind us, I noticed a growing crowd of onlookers gathering to witness the unexpected event in front of them. As the last ogre exited from the tunnel, the mage put her arms down, and with it the shroud fell as well. Finished, she soon too fell backwards to the ground, and gasped heavily for air, seemingly drained of all her energy after the amazing feat. Looking up at me with a smile on her face, she made a simple statement in between deep breaths. It is done. You have led the ogres to your safety. Indeed, though this wasn't the proper way to go about it. I heard a voice state behind me. Turning around to see the general, I quickly noted the large company of guards breaking through the onlookers and making our way toward us. For a moment I wondered if there would be trouble, but the generals eventually gave the order for the soldiers to carry the ogres to the healers. As the general began to approach, the enchantress's eyes seemed to dart quickly towards me. Stopping for a moment to give me a quick look over, he stated in a quiet but authoritative voice, "You should head over to the ogres as well," before continuing on past me toward the enchantress. Standing above the young thalore as she slowly caught her breath, I could see him fold his arms. Deciding for now it would be best to follow the orders of the general, I proceeded to make my way to Elva's medical facilities as well. Naively thinking I would look for a chief healer and see how I could help out, I made my way into the building and asked the closest healer where I could find him. I can still remember the shock on the face of the healer's face, as it hadn't even occurred to me at that time that the general had suggested that I head over to healers for my own injuries, not just for the ogres. It didn't take long for what seemed like one healer after another to be called over, before it seemed like half of the healers in the building were tending to me, including some of those that were originally tending to the ogres. I can't say I remember much as to what happened either. I couldn't even remember feeling any pain from any of the injuries I apparently had, though the healers recognized how critical those injuries were. I was promptly whisked away to one of the empty beds and given several anesthetic infusions, which subsequently caused me to black out. I would learn later that the healers were aghast at how brutally injured I truly was, but were truly horrified when the regenerative infusions that they applied seemingly failed to have much effect. Despite how many they applied, it would take my body a few months to recover, not to mention countless infusions. Even to this day, I am told to be careful of injury due to how long it takes for me to heal. Eventually, when I woke up, and after the healers had checked me over, I was told to wait as someone wished to visit me. After a period of time, I was greeted by the enchantress once more. "I see you are doing alright. You're certainly quite tough, thalore. Don't worry about the ogres. Iranian has granted them the asylum here as requested." She spoke proudly, though I could sense a hint of disappointment in her voice. "Now then, I realize you have only woken up, but Ariam wants me to get the story from you as to what transpired after you had left for the Nagal Kingdom, to the point when you came back to Elvala. Perhaps as well, you might shed some light on why exactly it took so long to heal as well." Alright, so I'll note this is like, fairly heavy lore-based sort of piece of lore here I basically wrote, because it basically builds off a lot of the workings basically of different races. So we basically see the Stroller basically starts as the floors being not completely backwards with runes, as they don't recognize how to use them, but it turns out they are. We also basically see, like, basically, like, this, like, Shalor here, she's not necessarily following protocol, so to speak, to, like, let people in. And even though, like, she does, like, let the ogres basically in, she probably, like, didn't do it the right way. And more importantly, it probably, like, might have been, like, on her part, like, the reason that the ogres basically may have come in, but, there's no guarantee that, like, protocol wouldn't basically allow them in to begin with, so to speak, if you get the drift there. Now, I'll note that basically down here about, like, the medical facilities as well. When I'm basically talking about this stuff here, it's worth noting that basically, like, as I already hinted at in, like, the past, like, book, basically Faye is basically a cursed, like, character, and for those who don't know about the cursed characters in this game, they basically have, like, a healing mouse basically to them that makes it so very slow to heal. And this basically contributes to the fact that, like, Faye is basically, like, she's very hardy, for example, because he's cursed, but she takes forever to basically heal these zealots. And not a whole lot of, like, races are basically familiar with, like, this, like, sort of concept where, like, people just don't heal, like, very effectively as a curse, basically. I think there might have been some other stuff to talk about as well in here as well. Basically, we have, like, the idea of, like, the shroud being, like, the shroud is something that can be opened up by, like, one person, but, I guess, like, she has to either be very, very powerful to basically do it, and, like, it's only, like, for, like, each of, like, a small group, so to speak. Anyhow, I should probably note something, by the way. Don't eat celery before you're, like, doing recordings. You get stuck in your teeth. That's why I'm having a problem with right now. I've, like, celery stuck in my teeth, but oh well. I'll take a very drink of water because we're halfway through our chapters here, so let's get to chapter 4, I guess. Alright, so, the terrifying interview. I do not know if Alrin has forgiven me for the terror I inflicted on her, or the hatred within me she must have felt. While it was but a mere moment, I could tell that all my rage had been channeled into her very being. The same rage that I filled those fanatics with from before. At that moment, I could tell she knew how potentially dangerous I was. Ray, if you're reading this, then know how truly sorry I am for what happened. For the next 2 hours, the Enchantress proceeded to grill me as to what had happened after I left Elvala. In great detail, I informed her of my experiences within the Nargo Kingdom, and my subsequent travels along the southern shoreline of Maj'Eyal. Every so often, the inquisitive Shalor would ask me questions about the fanatics I had witnessed, and the events I had seen them carry out or suspected them of having part in. To be honest, I couldn't tell if it was for her own satisfaction, or perhaps if it was Arian who indeed asked her in hopes of learning more about the fanatics. Eventually, as our conversation came to a close, that was perhaps when the most eventful part of our discussion came up. So, that mostly concludes more or less what Arian sent me here for, she began, before continuing to state. However, the healers also want me to ask you a few questions in regards to your body. I'm not sure if you have been told yet, but you have been in the hospital bed for several months now, despite injuries that should have healed in a few weeks. You wouldn't perhaps have an explanation for why this is. Immediately, I wondered if perhaps what had happened on the Char battlefield was connected with the slow recovery time of my body, as I had finally begun to realize that something was wrong with me at this point. I can't say I was too interested in talking about that instance, not wanting to remember what happened either. I wouldn't know why that would be, I replied, as I turned my head to look away from the Enchantress. Despite not being able to see Shalor's face, I could immediately tell that she saw from me immediately. So you do have some idea then, she cheerfully responded. I glanced at her in disgust, noting a gleam of satisfaction beaming from her eyes, although I couldn't tell what she would be satisfied from. I'm also guessing that it somehow involves your recent fighting experience. Judging from your reactions, I couldn't help but dart my eyes away, realizing that was the only telling her how easily and accurately she was reading me. She seemed to giggle a little bit at this, which only served to annoy me, and wish that she would go away more. The ogres I spoke to talk at great length about how you had led them here to Elvala, of how without your help they would likely not have survived in the fight against their pursuers. However, the more we spoke, the more it became clear that something was amiss. Curiously, no ogre would say much in regards to you in whatever battle it was that you fought, despite how important you were to apparently winning it. From what I can understand, there were many ogres with you too. How were you so paramount in the ogres getting here? I heard from the rangers that you held your own against a couple of wolves, but armed fighters are clearly a step above some hungry animals, and you don't strike me as having much in the way of combat experience. The enchantress intently examined me as she spoke, analyzing me for any hint or clue I would give her. For my part, I was actively attempting to repress my memories of those recent events, to not relive the mix of emotions that had taken hold of me at that time, to leave them silent. Intent on digging further into me though, the enchantress continued to press on, to meet the darker version of myself. What is it that you are hiding about yourself, that the ogres seemingly wouldn't mention about you? What unmentionable thing did you perhaps do to help the ogres through their plight? The enchantress continued on with the probing questions one after another, endlessly, never stopping, until finally I decided that she needed to stop. Cease asking me these questions now! The phrase swiftly escaped from me, though I had no intention of stating it as abruptly or forcefully as I did. The young thalore was immediately taken aback from my statement, her eyes widened, and a smile that one could mistake for a permanent fixture on her face now gone. She began to shiver and sweat profusely, all at once before staring out. What? She shook in her chair, and I could feel fear emanating from her body. I paused again for a moment, feeling a sense of satisfaction. The sensation I felt, it felt similar from something before. And then I realized all at once what was happening. My emotions were beginning to take a hold of me once more. Immediately, I pulled every force of my being away from the enchantress. She instantly jumped out of her chair and scrambled away from me, gasping as the pressure I exerted was lifted. Her eyes were wide now, catching a full glimpse of the darker me, and she wanted nothing more than to actively hide away. I'm sorry, was all I could muster to say. She looked at me, seemingly now appearing much older than before. Shakily, she made her way to the door to leave the room, to get to safety, to get away from me. Sometime after she was gone, I realized that a guard would be stationed outside my room, and I'm pretty sure the guard was not there before the enchantress had come. Eventually, as I recovered enough to move around a bit, I was finally released from the care of the healers. I was given a dwelling in a secluded part of Elvala, and a pair of guards were stationed outside of it at all times. Although I never asked, I was sure that they were there to confine me from the rest of the citizens of Elvala, and them from me. I didn't blame the thalore for this, as even now I could feel something driving me, influencing my thoughts, wanting to lash out. Who knows what sort of action I might have been pushed to do, or whether I may have gone into a mad-killing rage against the thalore, the irony of which is not lost on me considering my initial reason for leaving foreign lands so long ago. Alright, so there's nothing really to sort of say here other than it is as it basically is. It basically shows that here's something actually to talk about based about Tales of Maj'Eyal. A lot of this game is basically influenced by the realities of real life. And I find each of the different classes and backgrounds and lore and pieces of stuff like that basically in this game, it can all relate to something. In many ways, the afflicted classes of the Doom and the Curse, they're basically very similar to mental disease, and that's basically what I think that basically inspires these character classes and such. And I want to basically sort of write that basically into the lore here, where the cursed characters, they're very willpower based and stuff like that, but at the same time, they have to both use their willpower basically to assault their foes, but also sort of contain themselves from assaulting their foes, so to speak. So it's sort of a double-edged sword for them. Basically they're not really themselves, but they are. They're cursed. Alright, so that's basically chapter 4. Let's move on to chapter 5. The Festival of Happiness. So, it is worth noting that there were many ogres in Elvala after my long period of seclusion. Hundreds of them, even. Apparently the ogres I rescued had petitioned the Grand Council to seek out as many of their fellow ogres as they could, and help them before they were all killed. Agreeing to the request, contact was made with the Narco Kingdom, as well as some human kingdoms in northwestern Maj'Eyal, to secretly help relocate as many ogres that could be found to the shrouded shoreline lands. Now, I'll note this bit up here basically. I'll note that basically initially there's 50 ogres that sort of escaped from the Zigur camp basically, and of them like only like basically about like a fifth of them survived. But you know that wouldn't really like leave like really good like background story where, like not an ogre basically repopulate into like this massive like fighting force. So basically what you basically see today. And I basically want to like sort of like build on it a little bit that like no, basically like this initial action is just a spark that basically got the rest of the ogres basically into like Elvala, not necessarily like got all the ogres basically in Elvala. So basically like just like we have like this fleshing out basically out. So like basically Fay was like part of the reason that like the ogres basically came, but not necessarily like, the entire reason. So there's that. All right, so let's keep going on. As I finished fully recovering from my injuries, that was truly when I felt I was at the lowest point in my life. Having all the time in the world to think, I could not stop myself from remembering the events that had happened since the day when Spellblazed occurred up to the present moment. Every waking minute felt as if I was dreaming, whether I was asleep or awake. Yet this nightmare was real and deep within. I could feel the urges that I had felt afflicting me when I fought against the fanatics trying to claw their way up to the surface now. I was in a state of indescribable agony, seemingly hating more and more about my life, yet having no clue how to free myself from either my emotions or the cage I had been put in. It wasn't until a month had passed when a visitor would come to see me. I could hear outside the guards talking to someone, and from the distinctly deeper tone of the voice, I figured it must have been one of the ogres. After a moment, the guards let my visitor in, and I immediately recognized the ogre, Stratus, as he entered. With a solemn face, he began to speak. "How are you, thalore? It took some time, but I was finally granted permission to meet with you. Likely, if it wasn't for you, we ogres would certainly all be dead now, or worse. We never got to properly thank you for saving us after you led us to safety here in Elvala. And yet, while you freed us from imprisonment, we perhaps led to your own." As the strategist spoke those last words, he paused to bow his head, and I could sense every ounce of his sadness in that brief moment. Regaining his previous composure though, the strategist raised his head once more to speak. "We figured we would have a celebration for everyone. After all that has happened, everyone is in need of a good dose of cheer to take our minds off everything." Finishing the first sentence, the ogre looked at me, as if to add one more important addition to it. "And from what I've heard, you need something to take your mind off past events as well." I had barely clued in that I was receiving anything more than the gratitude from the strategist, but upon hearing that, I realized I was being invited into a gathering of people. Would I be okay, I thought? Could I potentially lash out again at someone? I don't know if that would be a good idea, I trailed off, hoping my uneasiness would be conveyed, and not any of the anger or the emotions that bubbled inside me. Seeing it, instead as a moment to speak, the ogre chimed in. "Because you don't know if you will be able to control yourself and have another incident like that with that enchantress." Taken a bit off guard by this, my eyes grew wide. Yet the strategist said nothing, continuing to stand there with the same solemn face that he had entered with. Recovering from his statement, I turned away as I stayed. I don't want to hurt anybody. It would probably be better if I stayed away. The less contact I have with anyone, the better. My words perhaps hit me the hardest when I said them. I hadn't realized it until that moment, since I had been busy trying to keep a handle on myself, but I was talking as if I was ready to become a recluse. I had spent 3 months here lamenting my situation, and yet now I was pushing away a chance to free myself from it. All at once, I immediately began to feel hatred similar to all the unfortunate events I had been a part of. But unlike before, when I had directed my hatred at others, I had no one to feel hatred towards here, except yourself. I blanked for a moment when the ogre said those 2 words. Seemingly connecting with my thoughts as perfectly as they did, I didn't know if it was a good idea or not, but for a brief moment the hatred I felt within me faded. Getting up and looking up at the strategist, I firmly stated, "I accept your offer." The ogre strategist seemed to become ecstatic at this, immediately taking my arm and making my way to the door. I couldn't decide if I was perhaps being led or simply dragged by the overly enthusiastic ogre to wherever the festivities were, but I certainly felt happier at that point than I had been in a long while. In the back of my mind, I thought that if there was a chance for my condition to improve, it would perhaps be through the interaction with others. At the very least, it was a way out of my seclusion, and perhaps I could get my mind off of the many past events that were now haunting me. Drawing closer to one of Elvia's main fields, I could hear the voices and sounds of rhythmic beating up ahead, and I could see a gathering crowd of both thalore and ogre. Attentive faces were fixed on a group of dozen ogres in the middle of the part. Observing the ogres, I noticed that they were performing a very slow, synchronized, and captivating dance. Those viewing the ogres seemed to be in little spirit, yet as the ogres continued to perform, gradually picking up the pace of their performance. Little by little, the ogres would move faster, before they encouraged the crowd to join them by clapping. Slowly, as those around them began to clap, the mood of the crowd began to improve, until I could see smiles crackling from a few of their faces. As the ogres finished their dance, a couple of thalore decided to step forward and entertain the crowds. One began to sing a pleasing chord, and then stop. Then the other began to sing a same chord, but at a lower frequency. Upon finishing the second chord, both thalore began to sing their chords, harmonizing them to produce a beautiful melody that washed over the crowd. Within myself, it felt as if I could hear nothing but my own thoughts for once. As the performances continued, I felt as if I was regaining peace of myself that I had once lost. Without a doubt, the infliction that had taken a hold of me was still there, but at every moment I felt less and less significant. It felt less and less significant. For the first time in a long while, I felt happiness, and even as the festivities died down and ended, I continued to feel happy. Making my way back to my dwelling, I felt in control of myself and my actions. Whatever the Anita was within me, it did not and would not lord over me. As I came up to the guards, I smiled and gave a friendly gesture. While I was heading back in for now, I knew that I would leave the dwelling again tomorrow. While the ogres are quick to note that I have saved them when conversation touches on past events, in reality, I believe that they were the ones who actually saved me. The ogres are quick to dismiss this as modesty, but since that time, when I was at the festival, I've been working to gain full control over myself, to take a hold of my life once more. For that, I say thank you to them. Alright, so that sort of like builds on, like, you know, the fact that, you know, mental illness, so to speak. Basically, like, you know, she has to get over it, and, like, you know, the best way of doing that is basically interacting with others, basically. So, hooray for that. Positive interaction at that matter for the most part. Alright, so this is sort of like a tidy up chapter, but, you know, we'll read through it. One more swig of water, of course. As time passed, both ogre and thalore slowly adapted to their secluded lives from the outside world. The thalore slowly guarded themselves and their belongings in a secret from the abandoned summits in the north, and then quickly worked to create permanent implants that would ensure that the shroud concealing Elvala would stay in place. They then worked to expand the shroud to encompass all the forests surrounding Elvala and lock off the Shoreline Peninsula from the outside world. After that, many thalore began to study the chaotic energies that had been unleashed in hopes of learning more about the damages they had caused and what effects it would leave on Maj'Eyal. The ogres settled down in the southern portions of the peninsula to rebuild new lives for themselves. They helped to grow and harvest food to feed everyone, and took up more laborious occupations that the thalore were ill-suited to perform. Many gave birth to children, resulting in a great many young ogres, helping to bolster their limited numbers. Some of the ogres also took up occupations working with inscriptions, and while my knowledge of runes is still quite limited, I could tell from their workmanship that their knowledge and skills with infusions were as good as many of the thalore I knew back home. Despite some disagreements the ogres had, they managed to create a thriving relationship with the thalore, one that I hope will last for a long time to come. In regards to myself, I want to one day leave Elvala and venture back into the world. I know though that if I was to leave, I would need to know how to properly defend myself, in case I ever run into a Spinax or some other foul group that would seek to cause myself or others harm. I also wish to learn about the rune magic that the ogres had used, and whether it could be something I myself may want to employ. Finally, I couldn't ignore the nagging affliction which influences me, as I knew that if I ever lost control and had my emotions consume me once more, that I may lash out against those who I did not mean to. With this in mind, I sought the help of those around me, looking to learn whatever they may teach me. I was surprised to find that when approached about this, both the Shaloran and the ogres were quite willing to teach me. Back home, few were interested in sharing their knowledge with others for any reason, and this included even between family members. The exception to this, of course, was when a necessity to Floran society existed, such as in times of war or other calamity, but even then it was limited. I will note, though, that the Shaloran approach tended to be to request something in exchange for me teaching them, usually asking for monetary compensation. The ogres, on the other hand, that I talked to were quite open in sharing their knowledge, and in fact one in particular seemed almost overly eager to do so. This was when my instructor, the female ogre who had helped graft the rune of return on my neck, approached me, offering to give me a full breakdown on the use of runes and their applications. I was told about the variety of runes that existed, and the various abilities that they can employ. I also learned about the basics of their use, being lectured on how they would gather a body's innate inner magic into arcane energy, convert that arcane energy into the magical effect that the rune would employ, and need time to repeat the process again. On top of this, a rune would create a magical buildup within the body, which would make subsequent runes use more and more difficult for the user to do so. My instructor was also keen to give me a hands-on demonstration regarding the use of runes to ensure I truly understand how they work. I remember when we first started out, how she abruptly disappeared from me in front of me, how I subsequently looked around aimlessly before hearing her laugh in front of me, as she reappeared again. I would be introduced to several ogres who would show me the multitude of abilities that their runes would grant them, and hear stories of how they used their runes in past scuffles or brawls. Finally, my instructor offered to give me a rune for my own personal use, a heaping rune. Unlike how my instructor had crafted the rune return on me before, I inscribed the rune on my left arm myself, and is still with me to this day. From the Shaloran, I learned various skills, specifically in regards to combat equipment. A weaponsmith gave me some rudimentary lessons on how to wield and orient a weapon in combat, before giving me the practice for hitting training dummies with everything from large swords and hammers to small daggers and clubs. From an armorsmith, I was shown various pieces of clothing and armor, and shown the varying effectiveness these armors had when hit with weapons. I even got to run a small training course decked out in a full set of plate armor that the armorsmith lent me to learn how to maneuver and run around without completely exhausting myself. Eventually, some veteran Shaloran soldiers offered to spar with me too. From that moment, I took everything that I learned and put it all into practice. For a time, I would engage in mock battles, learning how to regulate my stamina and when to use runes to give myself an advantage in combat, or just to make up for disadvantages that I might be suffering. It wasn't long before I could hold my own in combat, even against battle-hardened trained soldiers, at which point I was promptly asked if I would be interested in enlisting in the Shaloran military. Not having much to do, and figuring it would help in advancing my combat skills, I accepted, and for several years I would serve as a soldier in Elvala. It would also be within the military that I would get to learn a great deal about controlling my emotions. Enrolled in a program for those with unique abilities, I would slowly begin to learn more about the dark condition affecting my body, and how I could use it to my advantage. I would learn about how it could affect my surroundings, both inanimate and living, and in some cases I would even be allowed to practice trying to use the dark thoughts inside me against others. I can't say I ever gained full control over chaotic energies within me, but through concentration, I would learn how at least direct it away from others and prevent it from affecting people in my vicinity. When I look back at the events that occurred after Spellblaze, I wonder what life might have held for me had I not left to travel as I did. Much time has now passed since the time of my initial journey, but considering where now is the time that I would leave Elvala to explore distant lands and see what was blah. When I look back at the main events that occurred after Spellblaze, I wonder what life might have held for me had I not left as I did. Much time has now passed since the time of my initial journey, but I consider where now is the time that I will leave Elvala to explore distant lands and see what has become of everything in the world. I wonder how the rest of the people in Maj'Eyal are faring, and whether the lands have shown any signs of healing, as well as wondered what has happened to my fellow Thaloran back home. Whatever may lie in the future, I know I'm ready to make my way through it, and when I do, my escapades will continue once more. Alright, so that's basically it for the first 4 books of the Escapades of Fay Willows. Now, I wanted to basically just a piece of lore also illustrate something very important, because I'm pretty sure there's no heaping runes anymore in this game either. So a lot of the fact that there's no vision runes, there's no heaping runes either. So those runes are basically gone. And it's worth knowing that because that heaping rune is actually gonna be used later on in book 5, whenever I basically find it in this game. Now, I figure I should probably actually know something by the way as well, because I know this thing about it by the way as well here. So I'll note that basically when we're basically talking to the enchantress here, she makes basically a passing comment basically about basically about the fanatics and them not being killed outright here. I think I've already basically mentioned this, but basically this lore was basically written before the Krog were ever invented. So I think this lore is basically what inspired Dark God to actually create the Krog, basically to have a second race to add into the Forgotten Occults of DLC. And it basically sort of gives you a hint that even though the Zigur for conceived as being very evil, they're not completely without some sort of doctrine as to what to basically do. They're basically lawful evil, so to speak, the Zigur basically, and how they basically sort of operate. To sort of use a D&D term. And they're basically not out to kill everyone. Basically, they're just out to kill magic. And if they basically get around it, then they'll basically free people from from the afflictions of it where they can. All right, so that's basically it for the books basically here. Now I'll probably use this character to try and unlock the Krog basically if I can. And if I basically fail, I fail. But we'll see how it basically goes whenever we get around to it. For now, though, I think we've basically done enough of reading time here, so we'll save the game here. And I will see you guys next time when I basically jump back into the Cornac Marauder basically playthrough here. So take care.